الله بالخير. تتناول المقررة الخاصة المعنية بحالة حقوق الإنسان في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة منذ عام 1967 فرنشيسكا ألبانيز في تقريرها الأخير إلى الأمم المتحدة عددا من المخاوف المتعلقة بحالة حقوق الإنسان في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة، وتقدم مقاربة لحق الشعب الفلسطيني في تقرير المصير، وتطلب من المجتمع الدولي التدخل لإنهاء الاحتلال الذي طال أمده. ما توصيف المقررة الدولية للعدوان الإسرائيلي المستمر على الفلسطينيين في الأراضي المحتلة؟ ما موقفها من الإعلام المضلل فيما يتعلق بانتهاك حقوق الفلسطينيين وكرامتهم؟ ومع تردي الأوضاع الاقتصادية والمعيشية في ظل حصار قاتل، كيف يمكن للفلسطينيين أن يستمروا بينما تنهب مواردهم؟ ما مصير الهوية الفلسطينية في ظل حرب إبادة وتطهير عرقي مستمر؟ نرحب بكم ونرى ونسمع أكثر من ضيفتنا فرانشيسكا ألبانيز، المقررة الخاصة المعنية بحالة حقوق الإنسان في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة منذ عام 67 في البعد الأقرب. هذه الميادين وأنا زينب صفار، خليكم ويانا. Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, advised the UN governments and civil society across the MENA region on the enforcement of human rights norms, lectures on international law, forced displacement, and the legal situation of Palestine. Her latest book, Palestinian Refugees in International Law, offers a comprehensive legal analysis of the situation of Palestinian refugees. Dr. Franchesca Albanese, salam and welcome to الميادين. This is the proximate aspect. I'm Zainab Al-Safar. So good to have you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Zainab.
Few pleasure to have you. Well, Francesca, you have condemned the violent incursions by Israeli occupation forces into the Haram al-Sharif compound and the attacks on Palestinian worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque recently, blatantly using excessive and brutal force against Muslim worshippers, including, of course, elderly people and women. You tweeted, ma'am, that renewed violence against Palestinian worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque on yet another Ramadan turned into suffering must be condemned, investigated, and accounted for. How do you define and fathom these actions on yet another holy month of Ramadan, of course, adding to the daily violence under Israeli occupation?
Look, the reality is that Israeli forces in Al-Aqsa Mosque were reckless. The wanton beating and expulsions of Palestinian worshippers, including women, children, elderly people during prayer, is unacceptable and should be condemned. Mm-hmm. And this is why in the tweet you just quoted, I was also condemning an habit widespread among particularly Western corporate media, to often misrepresent the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. And in that particular instance, a major broadcast like BBC was calling those violent and unwarranted actions as clashes, so, or calling the mosque as a contested holy site. So I think this adds on the violence that was committed, which recalls what has happened in Ramadan, in the holy month of Ramadan in 2021 and 2022. Of course, these illegal actions taken by Israel have once again resulted in a predictable rocket fire from Gaza, this time even from southern Lebanon, putting civilians on all sides, Israelis, Palestinians, and Lebanese at risk.
Right. And today, what do you say to the Palestinian people, Francesca?
Look, I think that unfortunately, the situation of suffering is common to many people in the global south. This is the reality. The suffering of, in this sense, the suffering of the Palestinian people is not unique. There is a tremendous incoherence in the international order, an international legal system. But the Palestinian situation is unique in terms of its protractedness and at the same time the clarity of international norms and the impossibility, despite the necessity of resolving the situation using international law.
Right. As UN Special Rapporteur, you have not been able to visit the occupied Palestinian territories before the submission of the present report, despite an invitation received by the permanent observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva. Access to the occupied Palestinian territory is a key element of your mandate, Francesca. As UN Special Rapporteur, why do you think your request to visit the occupied Palestinian territory has been denied?
Let me say, as a Special Rapporteur, as you rightly point out, my mandate requires that I conduct country visits upon invitation from the authorities of those countries. So yes, I received an invitation from the State of Palestine, which represents the Palestinian people. And the Palestinian people is the recognized sovereign over the occupied Palestinian territory. So going back to your question, Israel cannot hamper my entry to the OPT and must comply with its duties as a member of the UN, which also means not hampering freedom of movement at large for the Palestinian people. Because if it was only my situation, that would be an issue. But the freedom of movement of many, all Palestinians under occupation is hampered, and there are many human rights monitors and observers who have been prevented from entering. Think of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which has been de facto expelled from the occupied Palestinian territory, from Ramallah, and of course Gaza as well, for the past 2 years.
This pattern of non-cooperation by Israel with the mandate holder is a serious concern, of course. How does the outcome of reports and resolutions by the United Nations in relevance to the breaches or violations of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories materialize, Francesca? And what were the reactions to your report and recommendations?
Of course, non-compliance by Israel and its tolerance has enormous consequences. It leads to the erosion of the force of international law and erosion of the force of the United Nations as the guardian of an international order premised upon compliance with international law. Other than that, I believe that as you also asked me about how my report has been received.
Yes.
There has been I submitted one report last October to the General Assembly, and I'm preparing the next one to the Human Rights Council to be discussed in July. So my first report received a lot of attention, has been widely disseminated and generated questions, and possibly, I hope, also contributed to a new language, to the acceptance of the new language, because in fact, the fact that the violations of the right of self-determination by the occupation is something that the Palestinians have denounced for decades. So I do hope this has contributed to a narration of the reality on the ground, more in line with international. Of course, there has also been criticism. I've been accused of supporting terrorism, of being biased, of being anti-Semitic. This is nothing new, because whomever tries to call for justice and accountability in the context of the occupied Palestinian territory faces the same kind of aggressive and abusive attacks.
Very true. In this sense, your recent statements urge the UN to move beyond simply counting casualties and calling for restraint. The UN cannot indulge in the condescending acceptance of an irresolvable conflict and the myth of conflicting narratives, and in urging the parties to de-escalate tensions and resume negotiations. These are your words. That's what you believe in, yeah. Dr. فرانشيسكا. You insist that in reality there are no equal parties nor a proper conflict, but rather an oppressive regime that threatens the right of an entire people to exist. It begs here the question, the international community has systematically failed to hold Israel accountable, thus enabling its impunity and permitting its settler colonial appetite endeavors. Why?
Yes, I've often raised the criticism against the actions of the international community, which have resulted, on the one hand, in analyzing, as it's happening these days, incidents of violence as if they were happening in isolation. There is violence here, violence there, and this leads to condemnation and to call for de-escalation. There is another tendency, which is even more alarming to me, which is to treat the reality in the occupied Palestinian territory as if it was a conflict, because a conflict doesn't render the sense of the reality on the ground, nor its legal status, and to treat its symptoms, to treat it as a humanitarian situation. So I denounce what I call the Band-Aid aid. I mean, aid is needed in a context where a humanitarian emergency is the consequence of a lack of resolve of a political situation in line with international law. So this is extremely dangerous to me, because eventually, by not resolving and not addressing the root causes, the current reality is perpetuated, and in fact, it becomes worse and worse each day.
Sure. Well, strategic fragmentation has been part of the Israeli toolbox to contain and control the Palestinian people, curtailing freedom of movement inside and outside the occupied territory, depriving them, of course, of access to large areas of land, punctuating it with roadblocks, checkpoints, diversions, the apartheid wall, of course, and more. The fragmentation and separation in the occupied territories have been meticulously planned and executed, Dr. Albanese. How to prevent, in your opinion, the systematic fragmentation and separation among the families in the occupied territories and in Gaza, of course?
Yeah, because territorial sovereignty is one of the four fundamental components of the right of self-determination, together with the sovereignty over economic resources, natural resources, for example, with the expression of cultural identity, and with the existence, with the political existence of a people. Of course, the fragmentation of the territory, it's an infringement of this territorial sovereignty. And I've said in the report that this is part and parcel of Israel's toolbox to control the occupied people by confining them, restricting their freedom of movement and all other freedoms connected to that. there is no way to resolve one of these issues without the others. In the sense, all these elements have to be resolved, which means the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people needs to materialize. So the only way out is to dismantle all forms of Israeli domination. First and foremost, their military occupation. Because while Israel's security, I don't dismiss Israel's security needs or security concerns, but I do not understand how Israel can pursue security and safety for its own citizens by building 270 colonies in occupied territory, by helping transferring 750,000 settlers, many of whom are violent in clear disregard of what international law says. So this is why there is no way out without the end of the military occupation and without the end of colonization. And this is not a term that I use as a slogan. This has a clear legal meaning and it's prohibited under international law.
Yes, well, to add pain to injury with the dire consequences of an acute economic situation, how can the Palestinians go on while their natural resources are being plundered?
They can't. I mean, if by going on we mean how they can go on peacefully and in dignity and humanity under the current regime, they cannot, because the system of control and restrictions that Israel enforces in the occupied Palestinian territory to the exclusive profit of its colonies intentionally prevents the possibility of the Palestinians to freely pursue the economic development that is needed to a people and to a state to function, to dispose of their natural resources and wealth. And look, there is an expression that has been used by scholar Sarah Roy, which is very fitting for the current situation. It's de-development. I believe that the Israeli occupation has deliberately engineered the de-development of the occupied Palestinian territory, which is part and parcel of the project to prevent Palestinian self-determination while advancing a settler colonial endeavor.
Well, we all know that with the extreme, abhorrent, harrowing practices of the Israeli occupier, even more now with the extreme fascist government in office, seen by international observers as perpetrating a genocide against the Palestinians. How can the Palestinians maintain their identity in light of an ongoing ethnic cleansing against them, Dr. Albanese?
Look, I believe that the ongoing violence, which is heightened and extreme, is not the outcome of extremist elements to government, to power. This is the result of almost 56 years of acquisitive, repressive, and segregationist policies implemented by successive Israeli governments, including leftist governments. And in such an environment, any display of collective identity, any display of reclaimed sovereignty by the subjugated people is a threat to the regime. So what is to be done is to resist to this logic of deconstruct and replace Palestinian through the elimination and the appropriation of their heritage and symbols and their very existence, but mobilizing their forces to while fully complying with international law. I know that it's painful because international law seems to have failed so far the Palestinian people. But and this notwithstanding, many Palestinians continue to believe and to act for the effectiveness of international law. This is the only way out, because going against international law will bring further violence and the perpetuation of this cycle of aberration.
Right. And what do you call, how do you define the systematic suppression of voices, particularly journalists, human rights defenders, activists and lawyers, like, for instance, the cold-blooded assassination of Shireen Abu Aqli? No one up till now is held accountable for this crime.
Yeah, Look, journalists are regularly amongst the victims of the violence in the occupied Palestinian territory because they contribute to expose by reporting and documenting the Israeli abuses. And Shirin Abu Akleh's case is emblematic of the lack of accountability that is granted and even protected to Israel by the international community. This is deplorable, irresponsible, and immoral. And this happens despite the fact that independent, transparent, and thorough investigation have occurred and have provided findings. So how to react to it? I feel like a broken disc, repeating over and over the same thing. But the only way to end this situation is to ensure that what is prescribed to maintain international order is followed. My fear, Zainab, is that the situation is, in order to ask for accountability, the space to ask for accountability is shrinking further and further. And the way I call it is persecution, sure, which under international law may constitute a crime against humanity. So it's even prosecutable under the Rome Statute. The fact is that this is not only happening in the occupied Palestinian territory, because there are practices aiming at silencing whomever tries to defend and advocate for human rights and justice in the occupied Palestinian territory, being them Palestinians, Israelis, or even foreigners, through this widespread use of the anti-Semitic label, which is having a stifling effect on the exercise of fundamental rights, including freedom of expression.
Yes, true. States offering little more than symbolic condemnation, humanitarians providing band-aid aid, as you just said, and legal scholars entangled in theoretical debates need to do more. There is an urgent need for a paradigm shift, as you reckon, Dr. Albanese. How does that translate in regards of what is happening in the occupied Palestinian territories today?
First of all, I think it's very important to stick to the need to use the proper language. And I often say to call a spade a spade. It's not a conflict, it's an occupation which has naturally turned into apartheid while pursuing the colonization of the occupied territory. And I do not need to elaborate on that because it's evident. As I said, the colonies, the exploitation of the resources, the persecution of including journalists, lawyers, and political leaders. So this is not a military confrontation, let alone that there are no military forces. I mean, there are armed groups on one hand and one of the most sophisticated armies in the world. So we need to change the language. And the second practical step is twofold. On the one hand, I think that really now it's necessary to deploy a protective presence on the ground to curb the violence and shield everyone, but particularly the Palestinians who are defenseless, from further bloodshed. And when I call for a protective presence, this is in the interest of all on the ground, both Palestinians and Israelis. And in the long run, there should be a holistic application of international law, starting with the realization of the right of self-determination. By the way, Zainab, the right of self-determination is not any rights. This is one of the most important rights, and it's even enshrined in the UN Charter. So it cannot be derogated, and it's not something that can be negotiated. So even the parties calling for negotiation, you cannot have negotiation between an oppressor and an oppressed, between a colonizer and a colonized. You first of all, we need to ensure the end of the illegal occupation, and meanwhile, member states, both in the West, but including, everywhere, including Arab countries, they should not recognize the outcome of this illegal situation, and they should adopt the measures prescribed by the UN Charter, including diplomatic, political, and economic sanctions until the time Israel respects the rights of the Palestinian people.
Right, Franchesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. Thank you very much, ma'am, for joining us from Geneva. Always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, dear. لعل الاحتجاجات المستمرة في الكيان الإسرائيلي تكشف بشكل أكبر عن كيفية استغلال هذا المحتل للنظام القضائي للحفاظ على الوهم بأن إسرائيل دولة قانون ونظام، وأن العنف المميت والمتصاعد ضد الفلسطينيين وجميع الانتهاكات مهما كانت دموية ومدمرة مبررة تماما وفقا للإطار القانوني لهذا الكيان. نعم، يجب معاقبة إسرائيل ليس بسبب محاولة نتنياهو السيطرة على القضاء، بل لأن نظام الفصل العنصري والاحتلال المتوحش وممارساته تشكل تجاهلا تاما وانتهاكا صارخا للقانون الدولي. ولكن هل يظل القانون الدولي هو القانون الوحيد الذي يهم دولة محتلة ومضطهدة؟ من كل الميادين، سلاما وتحية، في أمان الله.